Welcome back, everybody, to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to dive into a perspective on the Ukraine crisis that you might not hear too often.
Yeah, this one is definitely a different take.
We're going to be looking at a 2014 article from John Mearsheimer called Why the Ukraine Crisis is the West's Fault, published in Foreign Affairs magazine.
Right.
So Mearsheimer is a pretty big name in international relations.
Oh, yeah. He's a big deal for sure.
He's a professor at the University of Chicago and known for his work on something called offensive realism.
Right. Yeah, that's the idea that countries are always looking out for their own interests, basically.
Yeah, trying to get more powerful, in a world where there's no one to stop them, really.
Yeah, it's kind of a dog-eat-dog worldview.
And, most people in the West, we tend to see the Ukraine crisis as pretty straightforward.
Like Russia the bad guy?
Yeah, but basically Putin just wants to rebuild the Soviet Union.
The old expansionist narrative.
But Mearsheimer says, hold on a second.
Yeah, he says, not so fast.
He thinks that the West is actually a big part of why this whole thing happened.
It's a pretty bold claim.
Yeah, for sure.
So he's saying a West is to blame for the crisis in Ukraine.
Pretty much, yeah.
How does he back that up?
Well, he says that by pushing to expand NATO and getting Ukraine closer to the West and supporting pro-democracy movements there, we basically pushed Russia into a corner.
Push them too far.
Yeah.
I see.
And he actually has this really strong quote.
Oh, yeah.
He says that these policies added fuel to a fire waiting to ignite.
Wow, that's a powerful image.
Yeah, it really gets the point across. Like we weren't just messing around. This was serious stuff.
Deliberate actions with big consequences.
Exactly.
And you got to think about it from Russia's point of view, too.
Yeah.
Ukraine is right next door.
Right.
It's a huge country. And it's been a buffer zone between Russia and the West for centuries.
So basically having a Western-aligned Ukraine is like a nightmare scenario for them.
Exactly. They see it as a direct threat to their security.
Like having an enemy right under your doorstep.
Yeah, and Mearsheimer compares it to how the U.S. would react if China started building military bases in Mexico.
Ooh, I see. Yeah, that would not go over well.
No, not at all. And the U.S. would be freaking out.
Yeah, probably sending troops and all that.
Right. It's all about perspective, isn't it?
Yeah, it really makes you think about how we often judge other countries without really understanding where they're coming from.
And Mearsheimer's whole point is to get us to see things from Russia's side.
To step into their shoes.
Yeah, and he says the West has basically ignored Russia's concerns about NATO expansion for years.
Even though Russia was pretty clear about how they felt.
Yeah, they weren't exactly hiding it.
I mean, even back in 1995, during the Bosnian War, Boris Yeltsin warned about NATO expansion.
Oh, yeah, he was pretty vocal about that.
Didn't he say something about how it could, burst out across the whole of Europe or something like that?
Yeah, something like that. He was basically saying it could lead to war.
And despite all that, NATO just kept expanding eastwards through the 90s and 2000s, pushing further and further.
And then in 2008, at a NATO summit, they made this declaration that Ukraine and Georgia would eventually become members.
Oh, yeah, that was a big moment.
Huge red flag for Russia.
Basically confirming their worst fears.
And then what happened just a few months later?
Oh, yeah. Russia invaded Georgia.
Exactly. And Mearsheimer sees that as like a warning shot. Like Russia showing that they're serious.
Like, hey, we're not just going to sit here and watch this happen.
Exactly. And even after that, the West kept pushing for closer ties with Ukraine.
It's like they didn't believe Russia would actually do anything drastic.
Or maybe they just didn't care.
It's hard to say.
So they're pushing for NATO membership, but it wasn't just military cooperation, right?
Well, it was way more than that.
They were working to, integrate Ukraine with the West on all levels.
Totally economically, politically, the whole 9 yards.
There was the EU's Eastern Partnership Initiative.
Trying to bring Ukraine closer to the EU.
And lots of support for pro-democracy groups in Ukraine. Yeah, and don't forget about the billions of dollars the U.S. had already poured into Ukraine since 1991.
Geez, billions with a B.
Yeah, and Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State at the time,
right,
she said that the U.S. was helping Ukraine achieve the future it deserves.
Wow, okay, so the West was really deeply involved.
Yeah, they were playing the long game.
And Mearsheimer says this was a huge miscalculation.
Yeah, he says Russia saw all of this as a direct threat.
Like a personal attack almost.
Pretty much, they saw it as an attempt to weaken Russia's influence and pull Ukraine away from them.
So it became this big power struggle.
Classic great power rivalry playing out on the world stage.
And then in 2013, things really exploded.
Yeah, that's when the whole thing went into overdrive.
Yanukovych, the Ukrainian president at the time.
Who was seen as pro-Russian.
Right, he rejected a big economic deal with the EU.
And decided to go with Russia instead.
And that sparked massive protests in Ukraine.
The Euromaidan protests.
which the West was very supportive of.
Yeah, lots of Western backing for those protests.
Yeah. And eventually, those protests led to Yanukovych being kicked out of office.
Forced out of power.
Now, Mearsheimer says this was basically a coup.
A Western-backed coup.
And he points to that leaked phone call between Victoria Nuland and the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine,
Oh, yeah, that was a bombshell.
where they're literally talking about who should be in the new Ukrainian government.
Deciding who's going to run the country.
And for Putin, this was like the last straw.
The final insult.
He saw it as a direct threat from the West.
Like they were trying to take over Ukraine right under his nose.
And he reacted immediately,
Took Crimea.
which has a lot of Russian people living there.
And a crucial Russian naval base.
Right, and this is where Mearsheimer really challenges the common story.
The idea that Putin just wants to rebuild the Soviet empire.
He says Putin wasn't planning to invade Ukraine.
It was a reaction.
A desperate move to protect Russia's interests.
After the West pushed them too far.
Yeah, basically saying the West created this whole mess.
Wow. That's a pretty different way of looking at it.
Yeah, it is.
And you have to remember, Crimea is incredibly important to Russia strategically.
Oh, yeah. Why is that?
Well, for one thing, it's home to Sevastopol,
Okay.
which is Russia's only warm water port on the Black Sea.
Oh, right. That's important for their navy.
Huge. It gives them access to the Mediterranean.
So losing Crimea would be a major blow to Russia's military power.
Absolutely. And for Putin, the idea of NATO controlling Crimea,
Yeah.
that was just unthinkable.
So he was basically protecting what he saw as a vital interest.
Exactly. And Mearsheimer argues that the West's response to the annexation of Crimea actually made things worse.
Oh, how so?
Well, the West imposed sanctions on Russia
Yeah.
and kept supporting Ukraine's integration with the West.
So, they doubled down on the very policies that Mearsheimer says caused the crisis in the first place.
Yeah, basically they poured gasoline on the fire.
That's interesting. I mean, some people might say that this is letting Putin off the hook.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
He's the one who invaded another country.
Right. And Mearsheimer acknowledges that there are other perspectives.
Okay.
Some people believe Putin wants to rebuild the Soviet empire.
Yeah, you hear that a lot.
Others see him as just an irrational actor.
Like he's not thinking straight.
Right, but Mearsheimer pushes back on those arguments.
Okay, how so?
He says there's no evidence that Putin had a grand plan to invade Ukraine.
Interesting.
He points to Russia's limited military capabilities.
Yeah, I mean, their military isn't exactly the most modern.
And their economy is not in great shape.
True.
So he's saying Putin is more of a calculated strategist.
Not just some crazy warmonger.
Right. He's reacting to what he sees as Western aggression.
Trying to protect Russia's interests.
Yeah, that's Mearsheimer's take.
So if we accept that the West's policies were a major cause of this crisis,
As Mearsheimer argues.
what solution does he propose?
Well, he says the West needs to make a big change.
Okay.
He thinks we should stop trying to westernize Ukraine.
So basically give up on that whole idea.
Yeah, and instead he says we should focus on making Ukraine a neutral buffer state.
Okay, like Switzerland.
Exactly, a neutral country that's friendly with both the West and Russia.
But doesn't formally align with either side?
Right. He thinks that's the only way to guarantee Ukraine's security and stability in the long run.
But wouldn't that mean giving up on the idea of Ukraine joining NATO or the EU?
It would.
And a lot of people would be against that.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
They would say that Ukraine has the right to choose its own alliances.
The whole idea of self-determination.
Exactly. But Mearsheimer says that in the real world,
The world of power politics.
those ideals often clash with reality.
He has this analogy.
Okay.
He says the U.S. wouldn't tolerate China building military bases in Mexico.
Oh, yeah. Of course not.
So why should we expect Russia to be okay with NATO expanding into Ukraine?
Yeah, that's a fair point.
It's about putting yourself in the other guy's shoes.
Trying to see things from their perspective.
Yeah, and that's what Mearsheimer wants us to do.
So basically, he's proposing a real politics solution.
Acknowledge Russia's concerns
Stop trying to westernize Ukraine.
and create a stable, neutral buffer state.
And he thinks this is in everyone's best interest.
Russia, Ukraine, the whole world.
That's a pretty different approach from what the West is doing now.
It is, but he makes a compelling argument.
Yeah, it definitely gives you something to think about.
And remember, he wrote this article in 2014.
Before the full-scale Russian invasion in 2022.
Right, so how does his analysis hold up now?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I mean, some people would say the invasion proves that Putin is exactly the kind of aggressive expansionist that Mearsheimer says he isn't.
Yeah, that's a valid point.
So does the invasion completely discredit his argument?
Well, It's complicated. You could argue that it does contradict Mearsheimer's view.
Sure.
But Mearsheimer himself says that the 2022 invasion actually supports his analysis.
Like he predicted it?
In a way, yeah. He said that continued NATO expansion and Western involvement in Ukraine would eventually lead to a major war.
And that's what happened.
Sadly. Yes.
So the invasion is like the ultimate confirmation of his theory.
It's a pretty dark interpretation, but it does make you think.
About whether the West's policies actually contributed to this tragedy.
Yeah, and it's hard to argue that the current policy is working.
I mean, the conflict has been going on for years.
Relations between Russia and the West are terrible.
And Ukraine is caught in the middle.
Facing a really uncertain future.
It's a tough situation all around.
And even if you don't agree with Mearsheimer's solution.
The neutral Ukraine idea.
Right. His analysis forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths.
About the West's role in this whole mess.
He's asking us to see the world from Russia's point of view.
Which is something we don't always do very well.
And he reminds us that history matters.
That these conflicts don't just appear out of nowhere.
They have deep roots.
In history, security concerns power dynamics.
All of that stuff.
And we need to understand those things if we want to find a peaceful solution.
Absolutely. And sometimes even well-intentioned policies can have unintended consequences.
Yeah, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? Yeah, it really makes you wonder if things could have been different, if the West had taken a different approach.
Well, it's hard to say for sure, but it's a question worth asking.
Yeah, could this whole tragedy have been avoided?
Mearsheimer would probably say that the only way to achieve a lasting peace is through a negotiated settlement.
Okay.
One that takes Russia's security concerns seriously.
So basically acknowledge that Russia has legitimate interests in the region.
Right, and also guarantees Ukraine's neutrality to some extent.
But after all that's happened, is that even possible?
I mean, there's so much bad blood between Russia and the West now.
Yeah, and Ukraine is caught in the middle.
It would be incredibly difficult to negotiate a settlement at this point.
For sure.
But Mearsheimer would argue that it's the only realistic option.
Okay, what's the alternative?
A long, drawn-out war that completely destroys Ukraine.
Yeah.
And potentially escalates into a wider conflict.
Oh gosh, even a nuclear war.
That's the worst-case scenario, obviously.
But it's a real possibility.
Yeah, it's a terrifying thought.
So how do you even begin to rebuild trust after all this?
It would take a lot of effort on both sides.
Yeah, like some serious diplomacy and compromises.
And a willingness to see the other side's point of view.
What about the West's role in all this?
Should we keep supporting Ukraine militarily, or should we push for negotiations?
That's a tough question.
There's no easy answer.
And Mearsheimer emphasizes that this is ultimately a conflict between Russia and Ukraine.
The West can try to help find a peaceful solution.
But we can't force it on them.
It has to come from Russia and Ukraine themselves.
It's their future on the line.
Exactly. And we have to be honest about the risks of our own actions.
Like sending more weapons to Ukraine.
Could that prolong the fighting?
And increase the risk of a wider war.
Those are serious risks.
And at some point, we have to ask ourselves if those risks are worth it.
It's a difficult balancing act, for sure.
We want to support Ukraine's right to defend itself.
But we also don't want to sleepwalk into a larger conflict.
Especially one involving nuclear weapons.
Yeah, the stakes are incredibly high.
And we can't forget about the human cost of this war.
The people of Ukraine are suffering terribly.
And it's a tragedy for everyone involved.
Russia, the West, the whole world.
It's a reminder of how fragile peace is.
And how devastating conflict can be.
Well, this deep dive has definitely given us a lot to think about.
Mearsheimer's article offers a really interesting perspective.
It challenges the conventional wisdom.
And forces us to ask some tough questions about the West's role in this crisis.
It's a reminder that the world is complicated.
There are always multiple sides to every story.
And it's important to understand those different perspectives.
Even if we don't agree with them.
And we also have to remember that good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes.
Sometimes even the most powerful countries can make mistakes.
And those mistakes can have serious consequences.
That's a lesson we should never forget.
Well, on that note, I think we're going to wrap up this deep dive.
It's been a great discussion.
We hope you found it informative.
And thought-provoking.
And we encourage you to continue exploring these issues.
Read more about the Ukraine crisis.
Think critically about the different perspectives.
And engage in thoughtful conversations about how we can build a more peaceful world.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for tuning in to the Power Book of Podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join our growing community. Click the bell icon so you never miss an update. We have so much more inspiring content coming your way.